We're delighted and privileged to have with us Professor Barry Strauss to lecture on the intriguing subject of Masters of Command, Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, and the Genius of Leadership. Professor Strauss is the chair of the Department of History at Cornell University in Ithaca. He's a noted scholar of ancient Greek history, but also extends far beyond that, as you'll see from his publications, and is a leading expert, particularly in military history and on the issue of leadership. He's received numerous awards and honors from various institutions, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Academy in Rome, the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, and so on. He's also, I'm sure, well known to you for more than a dozen television documentaries on the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, National Geographic Channel, and elsewhere, and has published op-ed pieces in the Washington Post, the LA Times, and Newsday. On a more academic, or if you like, or scholarly level, of course, he is also the editor of the Princeton History of the Ancient World and a contributing editor of the Quarterly Journal of Military History. I was interested to learn that he's also an avid rower, and in 1999 published Rowing Against the Current on learning to scull at 40. So there's hope for some of us yet. Currently he's writing a book on the death of Julius Caesar, which, as you'll see from his other publications, is in a sense a natural progression. These books have been translated into 9 foreign languages. Let me just read you some of the titles. The Anatomy of Error, The Lessons of Ancient Military Disasters for Modern Strategists. Hegemonic Rivalry from Thucydides to the Nuclear Age. War and Democracy, a comparative study of the Korean War and the Peloponnesian War. The Battle of Salamis, which was the Washington Post named as one of the best books of the year, and in recognition of which he was named an honorary citizen of Salamis in Greece. The Trojan War, A New History. The Spartacus War, and most recently the book on the subject of which he will lecture tonight, Masters of Command, Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, and the Genius of Leadership. Let me also, though, as well as thanking him in advance, thank all of the members of the Villa Council for the support they provide to the programming, the education programming, exhibitions, theatre productions, and other things that is the mission of the Villa Council. They're great supporters of our involvement with the ancient world, and it is much appreciated, their support, of course, for this lecture being one of the things they do, and we're delighted that they do it, and I encourage any of you who are interested in joining to be in touch with us. But with that note of self-promotion, let me now hand over the lectern to Professor Strauss to give his lecture on Masters of Command, Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, and the Genius of Leadership. Professor Strauss.
Thank you all. Thank you, Tim, for that very generous introduction. And I'd like to thank the Villa Council for their support of this lecture. I'd also like to thank Claire Lyons for the invitation and Annie Combs-Brooke for enormous help in matters logistical. And there are too many people here to thank who've just been incredibly kind, and I'm deeply grateful. It's a wonderful experience to have the chance to talk here at the Getty Villa. There can hardly be a more stirring and evocative place in this continent to talk about the ancient world. Well, my subject tonight is Masters of Command. As you know, I will be speaking about 3 of the most famous generals of antiquity: Alexander the Great from the 4th century BC, Hannibal from the 3rd century, and Julius Caesar from the middle of the 1st century BC. But if I had a subtitle for the talk, it would be something like Heroic Leadership and Its Discontents. I want to talk about these 3 great leaders from antiquity, but I also would like to raise the question of why we're interested in them and why we're interested in heroic leadership more generally. My thesis is that we both love heroic leadership and we fear it. That we are passionately interested in geniuses and talented people who stand out from the crowd, people who seem to be able to bring us to a new level and to cut through obstacles and achieve new goals. And yet at the same time, we fear what these people may do if left unrestrained. So I'll be, in tonight's talk, in addition to talking about these ancient figures, from time to time I will be bringing up modern analogies, which I hope you will permit me. I assure you they're none too controversial. But I hope that they will be reminders that the people from the ancient world, in addition to their many other fascinations, are good to think with. So, Alexander the Great, who you see depicted in this coin, he was king of Macedon. He died young, just before his 33rd birthday, born in 356, died in 323 BC. And as we'll see shortly, he had one of the greatest and most influential careers of conquest in the ancient world. This is not a depiction of Hannibal. We don't have a totally secure depiction of Hannibal, but it's a coin that was issued by his family and that projected the image that Hannibal and his family wanted the world to see of them. We'll talk more about the image in detail a little bit later, but as you can see, it projects strength, and there is the famous elephant. And third, Julius Caesar, the imperator, the successful commander as he is depicted here, labeled here, and the great general, the dictator. Now, Hannibal and Caesar, to some extent or other, modeled themselves on Alexander. They thought that Alexander was their role model. And why was that? It's because Alexander was a shining example of somebody who took a small but elite and professional army and attacked an enemy that vastly outnumbered him. In the case of Alexander, as was the case with Caesar, the enemy could vastly outspend them, had access to far greater financial resources. In the case of all three of them, the enemy had command of the sea. Neither Alexander or Hannibal or Caesar had a fleet that could compete with what their enemy had. In all three cases, victory seemed improbable. And yet in all three cases, they tried to achieve it. In all three cases, we judge them for their prowess on the battlefield. And yet, as we'll see, there was more at stake. So Alexander, king of Macedon, succeeded in conquering the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire, as you can see on the map here, stretched from modern-day Turkey and the borders of Libya all the way eastward to the Stans, if you'll permit me, and to the Indo-Pakistani border. It was, without exaggeration, the largest empire that the world had known to date. And Alexander, coming from a much smaller country with far fewer resources, succeeded in conquering all of it. Not only that, but when he was done, he was on the cusp of beginning a new war to conquer the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. And he was already meeting with ambassadors from Italy and from Carthage who were afraid that they were on his hit list next, which they probably were. And if not for his untimely death, who knows where his campaign of conquest would have led. And yet, Alexander planned to be establishing an empire and a dynasty, and neither one survived him. He had two sons, one legitimate, one illegitimate, and neither one lived to reign. His empire fell apart. His generals turned on each other and engaged in 50 years of civil war, at the end of which Alexander's new conquests had broken up into several successor kingdoms. Judged as the creator of an empire, Alexander was a failure. But judged as a change agent, Alexander was a success. he most certainly brought change to the world. He expanded the reach of Greek-speaking civilization vastly. He ended, for once and for all, the day of the Greek city-state as the arbiter of the Eastern Mediterranean world. He ended the Persian Empire and replaced it with a series of Greco-Macedonian empires. But it was not what he had in mind. And one of the things we'll want to talk about tonight is why did things turn out the way they did. Hannibal, who was a student of Alexander and who had studied Greek history and Greek military techniques, also planned a war against an enemy that was vastly superior in many ways. Hannibal was a Carthaginian. He came from the city which is in modern-day Tunisia, and his father was a great general. Indeed, Alexander's father was a great general as well. He was Philip of Macedon, the founder of Macedon as a great power. Hannibal's father was Hamilcar Barca. He was Carthage's greatest general, and his talents were put to the test during a struggle, a generational-long struggle between Rome and Carthage for control of the great prize, the island of Sicily, which is, as you have heard, you can see here in a new and splendid exhibit at the Getty. Hamilcar, Hannibal's father, never lost a battle in the war for Sicily, and yet the Carthaginians lost the war. They lost it at sea. Hamilcar was a land general. He felt that he had been stabbed in the back by the Carthaginian politicians who forced him home. And he raised his son, Hannibal, to get revenge. At the age of 9, Hannibal left Carthage. His father asked permission from the government to take his son with him to Spain. And they went to Spain, and there they carved out a new empire for Carthage in southern Spain, roughly equivalent to modern Andalusia. This was in some ways an even wealthier empire than Carthage had had in Sicily. It was rich in silver and rich in manpower. The Spaniards, the Iberian tribesmen, were great soldiers. And the Romans nervously looked over their shoulders and attempted to give the Carthaginians an ultimatum to stop their expansion in Spain or face war. Hannibal's father had long since died, and indeed his brother-in-law, who was his father's replacement, had also died. Hannibal had grown up. He was in his 20s, in his late 20s, and he was now the head of the Carthaginian army in Spain. He had not been to Carthage since the age of 9, but he had political allies there. And together they decided that they would stand up to the Romans. When the Romans gave them an ultimatum and demanded they stand down, Hannibal refused, and the Romans said this means war, and Hannibal was ready. The Romans thought that the war would take place in two places: in Spain, where the Romans would send an expeditionary army, and in North Africa, to which they'd also send an expeditionary army. As part of their victory in the first war, the Romans had taken away Hannibal's fleet. They'd taken away Carthage's fleet, And they felt that the Carthaginians had no choice except to stand on the defensive, because without a navy, they couldn't get to Italy. But they did not reckon with Hannibal. Hannibal's plan was, having built up an army, to take it and march it overland, a distance of 900 miles from New Carthage, the Carthaginian capital. It's the modern city of Cartagena in Spain, a distance of 900 miles over the Pyrenees, through hostile territory in northern Spain, hostile territory in southern France, crossing the Rhone, and then crossing the Alps. Crossing the Rhone and crossing the Alps with 37 elephants. Elephants don't like crossing rivers, and even less do they like crossing mountains in the snow. And ending up in northern Italy and terrorizing the Italians by bringing the war to their homeland. And he proceeded to do just that, to the Romans' consternation, amazement, and admiration. He left Spain with an army of 90,000 men. Didn't go very well. By the time he got to Italy in December of 218 BC, he had about 25,000 men. He'd lost most of his horses. Most of the men had deserted under difficult conditions, but some of them had been killed. Some of them died from disease. Some of them were killed by the various tribes who opposed them. But he had every one of the 37 elephants Ask me during the question period, I'll tell you how you get an elephant across the Rhone. But he also got them across the Alps to look at Italy with murder in his eyes in December in 218. Because Hannibal knew that whatever cards the Romans had to play, that he was the most brilliant general tactically since Alexander, and he proceeded to prove it in a series of battles. He handed the Romans the worst and most humiliating defeats and bloodiest defeats they had ever had in their history, including the most famous double envelopment in military history, the Battle of Cannae in August of 216 BC. And Hannibal might be forgiven for having thought, I've got it made. We've crushed the Romans. He killed 50,000 Romans on the field at Cannae at a loss of 6,000 of his own men. And yet, Hannibal lost the war. Rome survived. Carthage was reduced to a second-rate power, and ultimately, within several generations, the Romans wiped Carthage off the map. One of the most outrageous cases of genocide in ancient history, perhaps in all of history. How could it have happened? We need to answer that question as well tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Caesar. Caesar was one of the most brilliant men that a country not short of brilliant men and women had ever known. Caesar rose in Rome in the 1st century BC as both a politician and a soldier. At the age of 20, he won one of Rome's highest decorations for saving the lives of fellow citizens in battle. He then proceeded to become one of the leading figures in Roman politics, as well as a rising military star who put down a rebellion in what is today Portugal and northern Spain, and was voted a triumph, the ultimate military honor, by the Senate. Because of political maneuvers, he was not able to accept the triumph. He didn't much mind. It allowed him to go on a springboard to even greater power and glory, given the command to fight any enemies that might fetch up in Gaul. The Romans already controlled, essentially, Provence and the Riviera, but they didn't control the rest of France, not to mention Belgium, parts of the Netherlands, Germany, or England, much less England. And yet, between 58 and 50 BC, Caesar proceeded in a series of lightning, brilliant campaigns to conquer all of France, all of Belgium, as I said, part of the Netherlands, part of Germany, a small part of Germany, and also to invade England twice. Not a lasting conquest. Took later on for the Romans to do that, but to establish a Roman presence there. It established him as one of the most successful Roman generals in the history of the Roman Empire. It also made him by far the wealthiest man in the Roman world, a man who could buy and sell anything he wanted. And what Caesar wanted was to become the first man in Rome. He wanted to be recognized as the leading politician. But he had two problems. One was named Pompey and one was named Cato. Pompey had been previously the #1 general in recent Roman history, having conquered much of the east of the Mediterranean for Rome, and having comfortably been recognized as Mr. Leading General. And now Pompey saw his supremacy challenged. Cato was a very different sort of figure. He'd served in the Roman army. He was not primarily a general. He was a politician, a somewhat cranky and crotchety politician who nonetheless was a marvelous avatar of the old values of the Roman Republic, the values of liberty, constitutionalism, patriotism, and oligarchy. It was liberty, government by the few, of the few, for what he saw as on behalf of the entire Roman people. He feared Caesar as he feared no one else, less because of Caesar's generalship, but because of Caesar's political skills. He knew that Pompey might have been a great general, but he was a clunky politician. Caesar was the most charming politician Rome had ever known, and second to none in terms of his cleverness. And so Cato made it his business to join with Pompey and stop Caesar from coming back to Rome and enjoying supremacy. On the contrary, they fired him from his job as governor of Gaul and threatened to put him on trial and force him in the end to go on into exile, on trial for his various constitutional violations, of which there were many. Caesar's response was to turn to his men and say, a faction has taken over the Senate of Rome. These people care nothing for the rights of the Roman people, for people like you. Instead, they are warping the government for their own narrow self-interest. And on top of that, they are dissing your general. And anyone who disses your general is dissing you. Why might that be the case? Well, when Caesar ultimately won what followed, the civil war that followed, he rewarded his soldiers by giving them each a bonus. The bonus amounted to 25 times their annual salary. Anyone who's going to give you a bonus that's 25 times your annual salary is somebody who you don't want to see dissed. And so Caesar and his troops crossed the Rubicon, the narrow stream separating the province of Cisalpine Gaul, what's now in effect northern Italy, from Italy proper, and began a civil war. By the time the civil war was over, Pompey and Cato were both dead. Caesar had defeated a series of Roman armies, and he now stood, as Shakespeare puts it, as a colossus, striding above the Roman world. And shortly afterwards, he lay dead, killed not only by his enemies, but by his friends, assassinated on the Ides of March. What went wrong? Well, each of these men was a brilliant field commander. Each of them had one or several great battles to his name. This is the site of Alexander's second victory over the Persians, first great victory over Darius, the Persian king, the site of the Battle of Issus, located in southern Turkey on the modern Pinyas, ancient Pinaris River. The Macedonians were on your right, and the Persians were on your left, and Alexander and his troops stormed up those steep banks and won a smashing victory. Those are the Amanus Mountains in the distance, and the Mediterranean is just a few miles over here. Those mountains are nowadays, unfortunately, the haunts of, terrorists, guerrillas against the Turkish government, but that's another story. This is the site of the Battle of Cannae in southern Italy, in Puglia, where, as I said, Hannibal won one of the most memorable victories in all of the annals of military history in August of 216 BC. After the Battle of Cannae, his second in command said, Hannibal, now is the moment for you to strike on Rome. We must march on Rome, about 200 miles away, while the Romans are reeling from this great victory, and we will win the war. And Hannibal said, our men are too tired for us to do that, and Rome is too strong for us to take. And his second in command said, alas, Hannibal, now I see that the gods do not permit anyone to have all the talents in the world. You know how to win a victory, but not how to use it. And here, a bit of a dirty slide, this is the battlefield of Pharsalus in central Greece, where Caesar, on another August day in 48 BC, defeated the forces of Pompey and the Senate. The beginning of the end of the Civil War and the beginning of Caesar's rise on the path to supreme power, and then, alas, the Ides of March. If we judge these three men by their success on the battlefield, we can't leave it at that. We must also judge them by their political success and by their ability to cash in military victory and to create a political settlement. Because wars, after all, are only as good as the new worlds that they create and that they lead to. And judged by that criterion, none of the three was all that much of a success. None of the three represented the wisdom of Pericles and the Parthenon. Well, what I would like to do now, having given you the basics of the narrative, is to turn to an analysis. And in my book, I try to identify 10 factors that I think are essential if you want to conquer an empire. And while few of us want to conquer an empire in military means nowadays, thankfully, many of us have great ambitions. And many of us recognize and admire people with great ambitions. Again, I would suggest that there are lessons to be learned from these ancient generals, both about what it takes and also about what not to do. So with that in mind, let me turn to the first of these qualities, and that is ambition, supreme ambition. The kind of ambition that the ancients referred to as megalopsychia, having greatness of soul. The standard Greek word for ambition is love of honor. Honor was a very important word in the ancient world. The word for drive is horme, which gives us our word hormone, which will give you some notion of the kind of powerful emotions that can move certain people to want to achieve very great things. Abraham Lincoln, as a young man, referred to this in his famous Athenaeum speech, and he said that there are certain people in history who have ambitions beyond those of the common sort. They have ambitions so great that they not only can achieve great things and new things for their society, but they can threaten their society. In achieving new things, they will probably destroy things as well. But the one thing is for sure is they will change things. He called them members of the tribe of the eagle. Well, is there anyone in our society who's built a new way of doing things, that's created a new industry, and yet has also shaken up an old industry and threatens to change it forever and maybe even destroy it? Jeff Bezos, I would suggest, might be a candidate for this label because he has changed the publishing industry forever. The second quality required in a great commander, in a great conqueror, is strategy. And here I use the ancient Greek word of strategia, which literally means generalship. And I'm referring to generalship on a series of levels. On one level, it's tactics, the ability to win battles. The second level is operations, the ability to move armies from place to place and to have a series of battles to a more complicated goal. The third level is war strategy, the ability to come up with a plan to win a war. And the fourth level is grand strategy, the ability to answer the question, what are we fighting this war for in the first place, and what political goal will the war achieve? And I think our three ancient generals excelled in these categories in varying degrees. As far as tactics goes, I believe that Hannibal was the greatest of the tacticians. To win at Cannae, for instance, he had to coordinate his infantrymen and his cavalrymen in a very complicated maneuver in which the infantrymen would engage in a feigned retreat, drawing the enemy in after them, while the cavalry rode around the sides and neutralized the enemy cavalry by defeating them. And then, once he had drawn the Roman infantry in, the men on his flanks turned in on the Romans and managed to crush them in a vise. They couldn't retreat because they had no cavalry to save them in the rear, and they found themselves crushed between the Carthaginian infantry on three sides. A very, very difficult tactical maneuver carried out by Hannibal himself on the battlefield. Alexander was also tactically very, very sophisticated. He, too, had an army that was a combined arms military of both infantry and cavalry, and he was able to defeat the Persians by elegantly using those two arms. Caesar was tactically not all that interesting. He was sloppy, but he was effective. While Hannibal and Alexander were dancers, even artists of the battlefield, Caesar was workmanlike, but he knew how to get the job done. If we switch to operations, all three of them were very good at operations, but I think that Alexander was the best at operations, partly because he and his Macedonians paid a great deal of attention to logistics and to supplies. They were almost always well-fed, almost always had done great intelligence legwork. They rarely left anything to chance. With Hannibal and Caesar, it was not nearly as clear and not nearly as certain. When it comes to strategy, here we get a different sort of picture. Caesar, I believe, was the best strategist. All three of these generals were risk takers, and all three of them were gamblers. But none of them was as good as Caesar when it came to taking calculated risks. Caesar was very risky when it came to operations, but when it came to strategy, he was very cautious. He was always thinking one move ahead. For instance, when he invaded Italy in 49 BC and crossed the Rubicon, his goal was to try to tempt Pompey into fighting a conventional battle against him, because Caesar knew that the army that had conquered Gaul was the best and most seasoned army in the Roman world. But Pompey was much too clever to fall for that bait. His plan was to withdraw from Italy and to carry out a very well-designed fighting retreat by sea, because he controlled the sea, and building a new base on the eastern side of the Adriatic Sea in what is today Albania, Macedonia, and Greece. Caesar's temptation was to follow him, to cross the sea to beat him there. But he knew that if he did that, he would be leaving a dangerous enemy in his rear, Pompey's army in Spain. And so what Caesar did was methodically move westward to defeat the army in Spain before turning eastward to confront his main opposition. Alexander also showed a certain amount of great strategic skill. He knew that he could not defeat the Persian navy at sea. His own navy simply wasn't up to the task. His temptation was to take his army, which was a much better land army than the Persian army, and having defeated them in battle in what is the equivalent of Turkey today, to march eastward into the heart of the Persian Empire in Iraq and Iran. Instead, he moved methodically down the coast of the Levant to take out Persia's naval ports one by one, most dramatically in a long, bloody, difficult siege of the city of Tyre in modern Lebanon. He knew that it was essential strategically to do that before turning on the Persian army, because if the Persians had a navy and Alexander invaded Iraq and Iran, the Persians could have used that navy to open a second front in his rear in Greece. And so his strategy was to take care of that. What about Hannibal? His plan A was to invade Italy, terrorize the Romans, hand them such terrible defeats in battle that their confederacy would break up, their allies in Italy would desert them, and the Romans would be forced to sue for peace. And Hannibal would achieve what he wanted, which was to break up Roman power and to get back Sicily and Sardinia for Carthage. Unfortunately, after the Battle of Cannae, it didn't happen. The Romans were sufficiently strong in their political will. They still had sufficient manpower and sufficient ties to their allies in Italy that they were able to hold on. Furthermore, Hannibal was not nearly as successful as he thought he would be as a diplomat in telling the Italians, join me, I'm the good guy, I'm the coming force. The Romans are over and done with. I represent the future. And the allies held on, and the Romans were able to hang on. Hannibal did not have an appropriate comeback. His solution to this strategic deadlock was to open a second and third front in Sicily, in Sardinia, and trying to open yet another front in Greece, all of which failed. The proper strategy would have been to slowly slog against the Italian allies in central Italy and force them to, one by one, leave Rome. But Hannibal wasn't interested in that kind of warfare. He was a guy who liked to dance. He liked mobility. His idea of a military nightmare was a long siege. He didn't do sieges. Unfortunately, he did not have a strategy that was appropriate for his goal. And if you want a modern strategist, well, Angela Merkel of Germany is struggling to convince the Germans and the Europeans to hold together. We'll see if she succeeds. The next quality is judgment. And judgment is the ability to make decisions under pressure with incomplete information and yet choose the right course of action. In terms of a battlefield, that's what Clausewitz famously described as coup d'oeil, the ability to see things in the blink of an eye and to know what to do. More widely, it's what an author named William Duggan at Columbia Business School has described as strategic insight. And those of you who are familiar with the work of Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, might think of it as system one thinking. The ability to see things quickly and yet know what to do. Know what to do, not just for simple tasks, but for complicated tasks. And I would submit that all three of these generals had that ability. They just knew right from wrong. Alexander, for instance, on the eve of the Battle of Issus that I showed you before, he discovered the terrifying news that the Persian army had cut him off from his supply lines, that cut him off from his rear. And many a general might have panicked. But Alexander was fundamentally a cavalryman, and he was used to sleeping under the stars and living from place to place, not having a home base, being mobile. He was able to say to his troops, relax, we don't need a supply dump. We have them where we want them. They are fighting in the narrows. They outnumber us enormously, but they can't use that advantage in the narrows. If we turn around and fight the battle now, we're going to win, trust me. And it turned out exactly as he had said. An example of judgment in the modern world, well, Steve Jobs, he wasn't always right, but he did have an uncanny instinct. Leadership. Leadership, this wonderful word, this overused word. From the point of view of, but this very important word, immensely important word. From the point of view of our generals, and for many a leader, it involves the ability to command respect and obedience on two levels. One is leadership from above, when people will follow you because you order them. And the other is leadership from below, when people will follow you because they love you, because they think you are like them and one of them. And all three of our commanders had this dual ability in spades. Caesar, for instance, well, Alexander, let's start with him. He was a king. He didn't have to worry about lordly skills, although he was a very young king, started at the age of 20, but nonetheless a king. But he had a common touch. When his army famously went without water, when there wasn't enough water for the men, he refused to drink. And he always made a point of knowing what the men's goals were, what their hardships were, and always giving them the message that he was looking after them, particularly his Macedonians. He had an army of which the Macedonians were the core, and he was a Macedonian, and there were many other foreign troops as well. But he always made sure that the Macedonians were well paid. He always made sure that Macedonians got glorious tasks, but not necessarily the most dangerous tasks. And he always made sure the Macedonians knew that their widows and orphans would be taken care of. And he always visited the Macedonian wounded after battle. That served him very well. Hannibal. Hannibal made the men love him by sharing in their hardships. He slept with them on the ground in a simple military cloak when he could have been in a almost royal tent. He was not a king, but he could have had luxuries. He refused to engage in the luxuries, and he let the men see that he shared their hardships with them, while also being a rather terrifying figure. Caesar. Well, Caesar could project authority so well that he once put down a mutiny with a single word. Roman generals usually refer to their men as soldiers. Caesar always referred to his men as fellow soldiers. But when they mutinied, he got up in front of them and looked at the hostile crowd and addressed them as citizens. The message they took away was that they were fired. And that was enough to end the mutiny. That, and Caesar, leaving nothing to chance, negotiated behind the scenes and said, give me the ringleaders of the mutiny, allow me to execute them, and I'll give everybody else a raise. The other side of, he was no fool. The other side of Caesar was that he too shared his men's hardships. On one occasion, he had commandeered a simple house to sleep in during campaign, and one of his close aides was a man named Oppius, who was physically very frail, unlike Caesar. And Caesar said, Oppius, you take the one room in this house, I'll sleep on the porch. And of course, Caesar's retinue let it be known that Caesar was willing to share the responsibilities of his troops. I don't even remember who I chose as an example of leadership. Who better? Audacity. Each of these generals was bold and a risk taker. And this is Alexander on the famous Alexander sarcophagus in the Istanbul Museum, seen as the way he wanted the world to remember him, going into battle. For Alexander to invade the Persian Empire was probably inevitable because his father Philip had started the job, and Alexander was in no position to give it up. He probably would have been killed by his own men. But it was nonetheless a very audacious thing to do. Greece at the time was broke. I don't need to say any more. Persia was the wealthiest nation in the world, and it could buy and sell as many armies as it wanted. Alexander had precisely enough food to feed his army for 1 month. He had to win a victory or he would starve. And yet, he did this audacious thing, crossing the Hellespont, the Dardanelles, famously declaring Asia as spear-won land, and then making his words stick. Hannibal, as we've seen, marched 900 miles with those elephants and those men under very difficult conditions and got to Italy. And even though he lost most of his men and was in a terrible position, he made the Romans tremble, as few did in all of their history. And Caesar was the governor of a rebellious province, the deposed governor of a rebellious province, and yet he marched on Rome. It would be as if the governor of, I don't know, Texas were to march on Washington and attempt to conquer it and get away with it. And Caesar did. None of them was lacking in audacity. The movies say it all. Agility. They were all able to roll with the punches and to fight in a variety of situations. Alexander was the master of conventional battle. The 3 land battles he fought against the Persians are really textbook examples of how to fight a battle. And yet he proved himself equal to unconventional warfare when he encountered it in the East. And he was an early example of successful counterinsurgent tactics, and was a pioneer of using field artillery. And although he did very poorly in naval things naval early in his career, I think there's at least an argument to be made that by the end of his life, he had come to appreciate the importance of sea power. Hannibal also was a brilliant commander in conventional battles. Cannae is indeed one of the most studied battles in history. He was also a wonderful unconventional fighter. When the Romans finally got the message that they shouldn't fight him in a conventional battle, and instead they should harass him and prevent him from living off the land, he really ran rings around the Romans in his unconventional tactics, managed to feed his troops and raid some of the wealthiest land in Italy while frustrating the Romans in their attempts to defeat him. Few commanders have had so many surprises in their bags of tricks as Hannibal. He was a fantastic trickster. So this guy who was excellent in conventional battle also was supremely good at unconventional battle. Caesar, not quite as versatile in battle, although he did manage to succeed at urban combat when he is in Alexandria, where his most famous exploit is winning the heart of Cleopatra. He also is forced to fight in urban warfare, something he had not experienced before, and he manages to survive it and do very well, in fact, to come out on top. Caesar's versatility is more a matter of the fact that he was not only a great general, but a supreme politician in a Republican political system, something that served him in very good stead. An example of agility, probably a lesser-known figure, but a very interesting one, Indra Nooyi, the CEO of PepsiCo, who came in saying that she was going to make money for the company by moving into the health food market, and has saved a difficult situation by becoming the master of selling junk food. And PepsiCo is now very profitable again. That shows a certain agility. Infrastructure. Men and manpower. Manpower and money. It's a representative of manpower and representative of money. You cannot fight war without having these materials. And all of these generals did or they didn't. Alexander started out with a small but a very good army, not a good navy, and he needed more men, and he managed to get them. Victory attracted others to his banner, but finally defeating the Persians and getting access to the Persian treasuries, probably the wealthiest treasuries in the world, made Alexander the richest man in his world and allowed him to fund his armies. Very important because the Greeks were not supporters of Alexander in Macedon. By and large, the Greek city-states considered themselves the victims of Macedonian imperialism. Many of them wanted out, they wanted to rebel, and they might have succeeded in doing so had Alexander not been able to buy enough mercenaries to allow him to defeat the Greeks when they rebelled while he was off fighting in the east. Caesar, as well, was a master of raising money. When he chased Pompey to Egypt after the Battle of Pharsalus, Pompey is killed by the Egyptians. Caesar dallies with Cleopatra and then spends a year in the east before he turns westward to finish off his opponents. And scholars say, why did he spend a year in the east? Some suggest there's a romantic notion that he spent the year in the east to enjoy Cleopatra. The truth of the matter is much more mundane. He spent a year in the east to shake people down for money. And he went here, there, and everywhere in the east, basically saying, pay me or else. And when he finally came back to Italy, it had worked so well in the east that he then turned to wealthy people in Italy and said, it's your turn now. You too will contribute to this war to bring peace and security to the Roman Empire. Without these funds, he could not have succeeded. Hannibal got to Italy with only 28,000 men. He had hoped to come there with closer to 90,000. And he had 37 elephants, most of whom soon die, and very few horses. He gets some of it by living off the land and makes good some of his losses by winning new allies in Italy. But the trouble is, in order to win over new allies in Italy, he has to bargain with them. And they say, we'll support you, Hannibal, as long as it won't cost us anything. And so he has to get these allies at a cut rate. He's not getting much out of it. He turns to the home government in Carthage and says, send me more support. Send me more manpower. Send me more money. But they never do send him substantial more manpower or money. He does get reinforcements to use in Sicily. And we have to ask the question, and we don't know the answer. Is it because Hannibal himself was committed to a faulty strategy of fighting in Sicily, which I think is correct? Or is it because his home government is so suspicious of him that they don't want to give him more troops to win in Italy, because they're afraid that after defeating the Romans, his next move was to come back to Carthage and defeat them and take over Carthaginian politics? Whatever it was, he never had the resources he needed to win the war. Perhaps it's a problem of his own making in adapting a faulty strategy. But unlike the other two generals, he didn't have an appropriate mingling of manpower and money and strategy. Oh, and here a modern example of a figure not known to many of us in the United States, Gordon Nixon, who's the head of the Royal Bank of Canada. And one of the reasons he's not known to many of us in the United States is the story of the banks of Canada during the banking crisis from 2008 to the present is there is no story. They didn't have any crisis because they were extremely conservative about things, giving them something of the last laugh. The next thing is definitely not something that I recommend modern leaders follow, and yet it worked very well for our three commanders, and that is terror. Each of them did not shy from using terror as a tactic. Alexander, when he becomes king, at the age of 20, when his father Philip is assassinated, discovers that the Greeks are in revolt against him. And they feel that they can do this with impunity because Alexander is all the way off in the north fighting, I believe, in what is now Macedonia, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And they feel he's nowhere near where they are, and yet he hurries south and attacks the leader of the anti-Alexander revolt, Thebes, defeats the army of Thebes, captures the city of Thebes, and destroys it. It is an act of terror, an act of vandalism, but it makes the point. Don't mess with me. Later on, when he's in the east and his army is somewhat depressed and homesick, and there are very difficult conditions, he engages in even greater acts of terror against the civilian population in Central and South Asia. Caesar, in conquering Gaul, well, the ancient sources claim that he killed 1 million soldiers and he killed or enslaved 1 million civilians. We can be sure that these figures, as with many such ancient figures, are vastly inflated. But even if we cut them down to size, there's still significant figures behind them. Caesar was not afraid to engage in terror. When he invaded Italy in the Civil War, after the Gallic War, many people immediately surrendered to Caesar because they knew what he'd done in Gaul. In fact, in the Civil War, he was playing a different game. And his game there was clemency, mercy, leniency, except on occasion when he wasn't. Very successful, and he used only very select terror, all the more effective because he used it so selectively. Hannibal probably used terror the least of our three generals, but when he invaded Italy, and he arrived in Italy in December of 218 BC, and he got to what is nowadays northern Italy, his spies had gone ahead and established connections with the native population there, Celts, who hated the Romans and the Roman yoke, and had promised to help Hannibal. But when Hannibal got there and he only had 25,000 men, they said, wait a minute, we thought you were going to have 90,000 men. We're not joining you against the Romans, we're not crazy. Hannibal targeted one of the leading cities, just a small place at the time, the modern equivalent of the city of Turin, and he wiped it out. That was enough to convince the Celts to join him after all. Roman sources claim that when Hannibal finally was forced out of Italy and had to go home, he engaged in an act of terror against the people in southern Italy. Myself, I don't believe it, but that's what that's what the sources claim. Our modern example, I don't want to, cast any aspersions, so I'll use Gordon Gekko. Branding, very important if you want to be a conqueror, to give people a simple message of who you are. Here's Napoleon saying to the French that he crossed the Alps just like Hannibal and Charlemagne to conquer Italy. And you can see in this painting just what a dynamic symbol he is. Alexander on these coins that we saw before, he is young, and his hair is swept back to illustrate motion. He's in classical profile, he's handsome, and he's got these ram's horns, which are a sign that he is the son of Zeus. And he represented himself increasingly to people as a divine figure, because only someone who is the son of Zeus could possibly have conquered as much as he had. Hannibal's family represented themselves as the heirs of Heracles. Hercules for the Romans, Heracles for the Greeks, Melkart for the Carthaginians, but the same god, the symbol of military adventure, of strength. Here's Heracles' famous club, of victory. You see his wreath. He's a fairly buff figure. You see his neck. And on the other side of the coin, Carthage's famous terror weapon, the elephant. And if you like, in the Q&A, we can talk about the Hercules gap and the role that it played in the Second Punic War. Caesar, well, by the style of Roman coins on the time, he doesn't show himself as a classical god. He shows himself as warts and all, someone with sunken cheeks because of all the work he's done on behalf of the Roman people. But he is a victorious general, an imperator. He is a priest. Caesar was the head of the Roman state religion, the chief pontiff, and this is the religious symbol. And he also was a man who had triumphed in war. Not to put too fine a point on it, but Caesar had triumphed 5 times. And branding, my modern example is Irene Rosenfeld, who was the head CEO of Kraft Foods and founded split Kraft off. The old and not so sexy products are left with Kraft, and the new exciting ones are with a new company called Mondelez. The last of my qualities is divine providence. And this is not something that you cultivate. You've either got it or you don't. All the success in the world won't help you if the gods are not on your side. And let's save it for the Q&A the way that they were on the side or not on the sides of Alexander, Hannibal, or Caesar. So where does this leave us? Oh, a modern example of someone who was convinced that he had God on his side. General MacArthur, well, I'm actually a great fan of MacArthur, but sometimes he was a little hard to take. The ancient generals in the end failed. Alexander changed the world but did not create a new empire. Hannibal did not defeat the Romans. He lost the Punic War, and although he went back to Carthage and had a wonderful second career as an administrator in Carthage, so much so that the Romans chased him out of Carthage because he was bringing the country back too quickly. Hannibal ends up in the east, a bitter old man, advising eastern enemies of the Romans, but in the end, being cornered by the Romans who want to arrest him and bring him to Rome and parade him in a triumph, he commits suicide to cheat the Romans of this last victory. He lives to a ripe old age, but he has known many, many failures. And Caesar, when he comes back to Rome, he forgets his political skills, he forgets his ability to compromise and to charm. He thinks of himself only as the man who is the effective king of the Roman world, and forgets that the one thing you don't want to do to the proud members of the Roman Senate is humiliate them. And they took their revenge on the Ides of March. So what's the takeaway? The takeaway is that being a great conqueror like Genghis Khan is not necessarily the be-all and the end-all. Its takeaway is the lesson that leadership can be great and it can have its dark sides. Mussolini is an interesting case in point. In the edge of the city of Rome, near the Olympic Stadium, there still is one last monument to Mussolini. All the other ones have had his names erased. And there you see Mussolini, and then it says on the bottom in Latin, dux. Dux means leader. The modern Italian word for leader is duce. It is not. It was duce until 1945. The modern Italian word for leader is leader. It became such a dirty word that people tend not to say it. If you want to be a successful leader, you need not only the ambition and the judgment and the audacity and the other qualities of these great commanders I've spoken to you about. You need the wisdom of Socrates. You need the vision of Martin Luther King. And you need the humility of George Washington, who, as King George of England was said to have said about him, if he doesn't want to be king, he must be the greatest man in the world. Thank you.
Well, Professor Strauss has kindly agreed to answer some questions, and we have a time for a few of them. There's a microphone, so please just raise your hands if you'd like to ask. One down here near the front. Row row 4. All right, next row 4. Okay, start there.
You mentioned MacArthur as a leader, American military leader, that you think has some reason to admire him. Do you have other military leaders, American military leaders, Washington, for example, or who else is on your list of significant American military leaders?
Well, there are many. I mean, Washington, of course, Grant, for his role in the Civil War. I greatly admire Eisenhower and Patton, and I admire Ridgway for turning things around in Korea. MacArthur, as I've mentioned. He's a tarnished figure, but I admire Petraeus for what he did in Iraq. And his second-in-command, General Odierno, I also admire. There are many others.
So, how do you get an elephant across the Rhone?
I'm so glad you asked that. You take a raft and you cover it with earth so that the elephant thinks that it's just continuing to walk on land and not actually going on the water.
What about on the aisle over here?
I also have a question about the elephants. I would like the definitive word on how many survived? I've read in numerous places, including Adrian Goldsworthy's book on the Punic Wars, that only one survived. I've always believed that 37 survived, but...
Well, we're both right.
Yeah.
37 survived the Alps, but by the time Hannibal crossed the Apennines, only one survived. He had one elephant to ride south into Tuscany, into Etruria on. All the other ones died during the winter of 218, 219, after the Battle of the Trebia. He used them at the Battle of the Trebia, but he then only had one elephant surviving after that. It's ironic that they made it across the Alps only to die in warmer Italy.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello? What about we have Hannibal who had the elephants as a war innovation. Were there any other innovations that they used? I know Caesar had the shield and the sword, which were somewhat different, but anything else that set them apart technology-wise?
I wouldn't say on the whole that they were all that technologically innovative, but there are some examples. I mean, Alexander really did pioneer the use of field artillery. And he used it in several battles and used it very successfully. What the Macedonians, and here the great innovator was Alexander's father, Philip, more than Alexander. They were great innovators in using combined arms, and having combined arms infantry, and having very flexible infantry. So in battle, they fought with a combination of infantry and cavalry in a 1-2 punch in a very effective manner. They're also masters of siegecraft. Greek siegecraft really took off in the beginning of the 4th century BC in Sicily. If you go to the Sicily exhibit, please permit me a plug, the first city in the ancient world to be taken by the new catapults, which the Greeks invented around 400, was the city of Motya, later Motya, which was a Carthaginian city, destroyed in a very bloody and memorable siege by Dionysius, the tyrant of Syracuse. And there's one of the great statues of the ancient world from Motya is in the Sicily exhibit. So the Macedonians had taken this technology and perhaps improved it a bit, but it was really one of the reasons for their success that they were capable of carrying out sieges. Caesar, one thing Caesar did, he did a couple of things really well. I'm not sure that they were all that innovative. Essentially, Caesar is basically using the innovator was Sulla in terms of Roman military tactics. Sulla, who was a generation earlier and who Caesar hated, was a great innovator. And Caesar pretty much copied Sulla in certain things like using his cavalry springing his cavalry as a surprise, not his cavalry, springing his infantry, a hidden line of infantry, to stop a charge by the enemy's cavalry in battle. It was one of his great tricks, and it was not so original, but he does it very, very well.
I think we have time for just two more. There's one microphone there and another over here on the left side.
Can you talk a little bit about each general's religious beliefs and how they did or did not use religion to their advantage?
Sure. They were all very religious in one way or another. Alexander, I think, was really very religious. I think he really believed in the Olympian religion and was convinced that he just was the son of Zeus. It wasn't simply a cynical ploy on his part. I think he really thought it. There was really little other way to explain, from his point of view, how he could have been so phenomenally successful. Hannibal, we don't know enough about Hannibal to know what he really believed, but there's really no reason to doubt that he believed in the gods, or to doubt his belief in the patron god of Carthage, Melkart, Heracles, or that Heracles is behind his mission. Before going to Italy, before leaving Spain, he goes to the great temple of Melkart Heracles, which is on the Atlantic at Gades, modern Cadiz, because this was a symbol of what the Carthaginians had achieved. They had gone all the way to the Atlantic. When he got to Italy, he uses the symbol of Heracles as a way to bait the Romans, to taunt them, to incite them, and to say, Hercules loves us, not you. And the Romans are really scared. They believe there's a Hercules gap. So they build new temples and new shrines to Hercules. And one of the things that Fabius Maximus, the Roman general who begins to turn the tide against Hannibal does is he tries to say that he rebuilds Roman religion. Stop being worried. The gods don't love this guy. They still love us. Caesar's the most interesting and difficult case because on the one hand, he was really cynical and didn't believe in religion, didn't give a hoot about religion. On the other hand, he was the chief pontiff, and he was absolutely convinced that he had certain gods on his side, two in particular. One, fortuna, good fortune. And he really believed in lucky Caesar, that nobody could stop him because he was so lucky. And the other god that he believed had on his side is not who you'd expect. It's Venus. He was Venus's boy. And Venus was the founder of his family, the Julian clan, the founder of Rome, and Venus gave him his incredible charm, which made him a great politician, made the soldiers love him, made him win battles. Interesting case.
I think this better be the last one here. Thank you.
Yeah. How do you compare the three persons to Spartacus, which is, in my eyes, the greatest general in ancient times because he built an army out of nothing. He was successful against Roman legions. He was the only one who fought for noble reasons, and he had no governmental administration as a background.
I agree with you on all those points. I love Spartacus. I love him so much I wrote a book about him. The sad truth, though, is that Spartacus lost. And you might say he lost because nobody could have won, given that situation. He lost because he was unable to convince his army to do the right thing, which was to leave Italy while the going was good, and to disperse to their own homelands before the Romans finally came up with the troops that would inevitably defeat them. Whether he lost because it just was impossible or because his political talent was limited and he didn't have the political skill to convince the army to follow him, we can't say. We simply don't know. But there's no doubt, I completely agree with you, Spartacus was a very great general and very, very successful. And we should study him as well. Thank you. Thank you.